How's it going, folks? Been a little while since I last put a YouTube video up, but yeah, definitely miss doing this longer form content. And there are a heap of things that I've been thinking about whilst out in the paddock that I've wanted to talk about. So, just going to try and do a lot more of these, just sit down type videos. It's harder when you're out in the paddock. And you're trying to get jobs done. You don't want to spend too much time filming and things like that, but it's definitely something that I love doing, so I want to do a lot more of it. So a topic that I've been thinking about is the different types of grazing systems that we have. So if you've just taken over control of a piece of land and you intend on using livestock to help you sustainably manage it, it can become pretty overwhelming trying to decide on the grazing system to use, right? When we've got set stocking, continuous grazing, amp grazing, MIG grazing, cell grazing, block grazing, non-selective, high density grazing. So there are so many to choose from, and it's almost as if there's more variation between the names than the actual grazing practices themselves. So, in my opinion, most of these can be grouped into three broad categories, and the purpose of this video is just to kind of identify those key differences to work out what might be the best fit for your grazing operation and your situation, because everyone's holistic context is different, right? We've all got different financial positions. We're grazing in different climates, different parts of the world. What quality of life do we desire? Have you got kids? Things like that. So that's all going to be different. But I guess there's a bit of some basic criteria for us to go off so that we can evaluate some of these methods. I think there are about three things that at least three things, I suppose, that most graziers will agree on. And that is that the first is that as a result of our grazing management, we want the land to be in a better ecological state. The second is that we want to keep our livestock in a healthy, productive body condition. And the third is that ideally we want to make a profit whilst doing so. So these are, with these in mind, we've kind of got something to go off. So another thing quickly that I probably would want to do is just quickly shrink down and condense, a bit of an evolution of grazing management, so we can kind of get an idea for where we've come from, where grazing management has evolved from. So pre-domestication, livestock were just managed by natural factors, right? Just fires, floods, predation, things like that, and that'd dictate where mobs of herbivores or ruminants would graze and for how long. But once humans kind of came on the scene, knowingly or unknowingly, we assumed all responsibility for the relationship between land and livestock, with barbed wire and the ability to segregate large paddocks really quickly and effectively. So for many years, and in continents like Australia, settlers who came over to Australia were able to graze with the domesticated stock they brought to Australia, and they were able to graze virgin land, right? So land that had accumulated fertility for thousands of years before that. But and with that, they could graze it down until it became less productive, and then because we were so underpopulated, they could simply move on to more fruitful pastures, and we could continue this cycle until the population grew and land became the limiting factor. And so a common theme that was noticed among not just Australia but Africa and North America was that a lot of our land was becoming degraded, our soils were eroding, and our desirable pasture species were disappearing, right? And so this just led to the consensus between scientists and botanists that the degradation of our landscapes was a function of overgrazing caused by primarily cattle and sheep. That we were trying to graze. In 1912, a botanist named Arthur basically he segregated or isolated plots of rangeland over in America with timber logs, isolated those and kept cattle away, and watched as those pastures allowed to rest could revegetate, and all of the desirable species started to come back, which I think is it's pretty cool, right? So about 20 years after that, the first electric fence energizer or energizers were starting to be produced in America. And, to this day, they're probably the most revolutionary piece of grazing equipment that became available to stockmen, because now we could economically put a brake, accelerator and control on our herds economically, right? We didn't have to use logs like old Arthur did. And so since then, I guess over the last 80 years, innovative pastoralists around the world have just continually iterated on different grazing methods to work out what worked best in their environment and in their context. So when we compare the common grazing strategies, like the list that we laid out at the start there, the only thing that separates them are kind of three main things, and it comes down to the duration of the graze, the frequency, and the intensity of a grazing event. So just the levels at which those three change, or how intense we do that, kind of dictates the label that people put on a grazing system, right? So as I see it, we can break these down into three main categories. So the first obviously being continuous grazing. So continuous grazing, also referred to set stocking, is just simply when you turn out a set number of livestock and you give them unrestricted access to a certain portion of land. This is fairly common in Australia, given that water is often the most limiting resource that prevents a more intensive style of grazing. So a lot of people would probably argue that if a farm or a piece of land has been divided into 2 paddocks, 3 paddocks, 4 paddocks, that it technically can't be classified as continuous grazing. However, I think that the easiest way to determine this is just, do livestock have the ability to regraze a plant before it has fully recovered? And if the answer is yes, then I would probably label that as continuous grazing, right? So that's the issue that we have. So some of the pros of this method, I guess, are that by nature and being having a very low degree of management, the labour input is quite low, the cost of labour, so you can allocate probably more time to marketing or advertising whatever the end product is you sell, whether that's meat, milk, farm products. So that's definitely an option. And then the fact that they are allowed to be a lot more selective, they do have the ability to be on a better quality diet. However, that's only for a period of time until your pastures start to decline. So some of the cons with continuous grazing, obviously, as we said, that's kind of what led to the mass disturbance and detrimental impacts on our landscape. But essentially what we're doing is we're just giving livestock, we're handing over responsibility of management to our cows. And as much as we love them, I mean, livestock can't, they can't conceptualize plant physiology or things like that. They don't necessarily graze for their best long-term interest. They'll just graze the most palatable plants that they come across until they eventually wipe them out, unless we kind of intervene or something intervenes, which, as we said, would have been nature, but now that we've assumed responsibility, it's got to be us. So, over a long enough time horizon, we'll end up in the same position we were at with very unproductive soils. And by, I guess another aspect of that is by there not being really any density or pressure on our livestock, they're not being forced to utilise all of the pasture available to them. So not just all the different species, but the different parts of the plant. So they're not being forced to consume the stems and the seed heads. Our stocking rates aren't as high as they could be. So the second kind of category is selective rotational grazing. So rotational grazing is a really broad category that applies to almost all of the different methods of managed grazing, like intensive managed grazing. So things like mob grazing, cell grazing, block grazing, high density grazing, amp grazing, they're all forms of rotational grazing in a way. And rotational grazing for people that don't know, I guess, is just a form of grazing where you strategically rotate livestock through a series of permanent and temporary paddocks that are often dictated by the growth of your plant and the nutritional requirements of your herd. Right, so where I think these different forms of rotational grazing start to differentiate is how intense or selective those grazing events are. So this kind of comes down to how we manage space and time. So space just being the size of the paddock, and time being how long we were in it, right? And so for this reason, I think that most methods of rotational grazing can be grouped as either selective rotational grazing or non-selective rotational grazing. So starting with selective rotational grazing, I guess the ideology behind this is that we're not getting the livestock. Well, we're trying to get the livestock to consume only a certain predetermined percentage of the plant. So whether that be the top 50%, the top 30%, we're just aiming for a certain harvest efficiency. And I guess it comes down to kind of two main methods, two main principles. Is that the thinking is that if a leaf is a solar panel, then in theory, by leaving more leaf residual and more solar panel, a plant will recover faster. So that's kind of the first principle. And the second is that the tips of a grass plant or a legume are the most nutritional, right? Because they're the closest to the sun. They have the highest Brix concentration. Their levels of sugar, right? So, in terms of the pros for selective rotational grazing, so one of the major benefits is that you can generally have a high level of animal performance, because the livestock can select for their own diet. They're not being forced too hard. So it's also great if you misjudge how much feed is in the paddock, right? Because if you're leaving 50%, if you're wanting to take 50% and you leave 50%, if you can't get around to shifting them or something happens, then there's a bit more margin for error in terms that there'll be feed left over that they can graze down, even if it's lower than what you anticipated. And also for people that don't have much stock handling experience, we don't have too high a density, so it's not too unmanageable, and it's probably a good place to start if you haven't done any form of rotational grazing or managed grazing before. The main disadvantage of selective rotational grazing is we're facing the same issue, the same issue that you face in continuous grazing, you still face in selective rotational grazing, just on a smaller scale. So livestock still have the ability to graze those ice cream plants. Because if we're aiming for livestock to take 50% of a plant and leave 50%, it would probably need to be a monoculture, all of the same plant, right? Because in that case, the palatability would be the same, but that's not really how livestock graze. So they will graze 100% of a plant that they love, and they will graze, 0 to 20% of maybe an undesirable plant. So once you come back around on your rotation, some of those plants are under-rested and some are over-rested. But it's just hard to get that balance because all of those species are grazed to a different height. You can only really get a good 50% graze across all your plants if all of those plants are the same species, right? Additionally, if we're only taking 50% of the grass sward, then the other 50% is getting trampled, fouled, and it's not going through the mouth of a beast, and that plant energy isn't being converted into muscle or fat, milk, or just a saleable product. So we're not getting as higher conversion rates as we could. Our stocking rates are going to be far lower. So non-selective grazing, often associated with ultra-high density grazing, it focuses on using really high stock densities to harvest as much biomass or plant material as possible in that given cell, right? So given that overgrazing is a function of grazing a plant before it's fully recovered, regrazing a plant, before it's fully recovered, rather than a specific graze height, this system, aims to take it all, get a good total graze on it. So to achieve this, density is often the best tool, and this is accompanied by kind of short grazing durations and really small paddocks that require fairly constant moves. So as a result, you get a really even grazing pressure applied to the landscape because the cattle are taking 90, 80, 70% of the forage, as much as you can. Often it's followed up by a mulching or a slashing. So some of the pros of this method are the speed at which you can improve your landscape, right? Because the regrowth that you get from a total graze isn't just better in terms of nutritional value for our livestock. It's not only just less fibrous and a lot more palatable, but the quality of regrowth in terms of how well it can photosynthesize and turn solar energy into chemical energy and pump carbon into the soil is just much higher. So we're just getting a much more effective solar panel. So we can really heal our land, a lot faster. So this environment, animals are not only selecting for a diet that tastes good, but they're eating to survive. So by having them in those higher densities, it's triggering again that survival instinct and that competition for forage. And with that competition for forage, we're getting a much higher utilization rate of our plants, and therefore we can have more animals per acre or hectare because there is more available feed to us. So what are some of the cons of non-selective grazing? Well, probably the biggest downside associated at this stage is the labour input. So by nature, because we're aiming for densities to get a high harvest efficiency graze, livestock have to be placed in a small area. And by nature being in a small area, they can only graze there for a short period of time. If they're only there for a short period of time, then they have to be moved again. So even though technology is, I guess, coming onto the scene and trying to aid in this area and trying to help with those efficiencies, it's still probably the biggest issue is the labour costs that's associated with it. So the other aspect would be that it can be quite hard on cattle sometimes, and so it's definitely a balance of managing animal performance with the ecological progress of your landscape. So we never want to graze too hard. We only want to graze as hard as our genetics will allow us. So we don't want our livestock to go in, to drop in body condition. We'll graze them as intensively as we can without them losing body condition. But as you improve your genetics, that essentially allows you to graze more forage. Animals that are adapted to grazing the poorer quality and protein deficient mature fibrous grasses. So that's something to watch out for, definitely if you're starting on that non-selective grazing. So I guess the last part is, well, what am I doing at the moment, or what am I aiming to do? Well, it's kind of been a bit of an evolution. I started out with selective rotational grazing, and it worked for probably a little while there, maybe the first year or so. But what I came to realize was that I was the graziers that I was using as mentors, whilst they're world-class graziers, don't get me wrong, they were just grazing in a very different environment. They were all grazing in temperate environments, North America, and the pasture species are just vastly different. So they've got mainly C3 grasses, cool season grasses, but where I am in Northern Australia, it's a tropical, subtropical environment. We've got mainly C4 grasses, which they grow so rapidly. They're so efficient at converting sunlight and water into plant material and biomass. So when you try to do, especially in summer, that whole tip grazing method of just taking a third and leaving a third and trampling a third, the grass can just get away from you so quickly. The leaf to stem ratio can shift so rapidly to being less leaf and a lot of stem, and the plant can become fibrous very quickly. The cell walls can thicken up very quickly, and it loses nutritional value so rapidly. And in our green growing season, this can happen. and that's supposed to be our one, our time in the year that we get body condition on our animals, and we have livestock grazing high quality grasses. So I have probably in the last 2 years, I guess, transitioned over to more of that non-selective grazing method where I just aim to harvest as much as I can, as much as my genetics will allow, without sacrificing body condition. So I try to graze a plant as low as I can, and then obviously not return to graze that until it's fully recovered. But the biggest benefit and noticeable change that I've observed is the quality of regrowth that I get in my warm season grasses. So once they regrow, and they've got we graze them down, but they've got a really vigorous root system below them, because just prior to being pruned, they were fully recovered. They had reached full expression. So the regrowth that we get once they've got a strong root system is just a leafy, palatable, dark green plant, right? And the amount of gain, I guess, that we've been able to get, not only on our livestock in terms of kilograms per hectare of beef, but the gain in terms of healing a lot of our degraded soils have really been quite rapid. So that's kind of the direction that I'm going down, and from what I've seen so far is it's definitely the way to go in terms of the grazing, in terms of the way in which we graze a plant. The only challenge is the labour investment, and it can be hard if you're not always there, or you're grazing properties that aren't really in close proximity. So a lot of challenges. There's we've all got a context that we're grazing in that I think we've all got to look at. But yeah, they're a bit of a that's a bit of a look into the different grazing systems as I see it. So hopefully you guys got a little bit out of it, and if you got any questions, just drop them down in the comments below. Cheers.